Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to completely dismantle those classic textbook myths of ancient history and uncover the fascinating actual realities of human origins. If you've ever felt like the story of early humanity was presented as, well, just a bit too simplistic, you're exactly right. Today, we're digging into some groundbreaking archaeological evidence that is literally changing how we view the very birth of civilization. I want you to just think back for a second to what you learned in school about massive ancient empires. The classic story is always incredibly dramatic, right? You have a genius ruler who comes along, builds this massive centralized state out of absolutely nothing, rules with an iron fist, and then, due to some catastrophic event, the whole thing tragically collapses into dust. But what if modern archaeology is proving that's entirely backwards? This right here is the massive paradigm shift we're exploring today. We're moving away from that Hollywood-style dramatic rise and fall stereotype and moving toward a much more gradual, network-based narrative of human adaptability. It's really a total shift from rigid top-down control to incredibly resilient, interconnected communities. Okay, part one, Harappa, networks over empires. Let's dive right into our first major revelation. So, for a really long time, the colonial-era myth treated the Harappan, or Indus Valley cities, as this sudden great civilization that just kind of popped into existence, presumably ruled by a strict emperor. But the modern consensus tells a completely different story. Extensive modern surveys, especially in the Ghaggar-Hakra Basin and the Baluchistan region, have revealed hundreds of smaller, older sites that slowly fed into the mature Harappan phase. This completely shatters the old idea of an abrupt civilizational birth. It was actually a long, indigenous, and super gradual evolution. Now, what's really fascinating here is the sheer scale of their coordination across vast, vast distances, connecting major nodes like Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dholavira, and Rakhigarhi. We find standardized pottery, perfectly uniform weights and measures, and widely shared trade seals. The old assumption was, well, you'd obviously need a dictator to enforce that kind of strict standardization, right? But the archaeological record actually shows that these shared institutions and trade practices prove they were deeply connected culturally and economically, but absolutely not necessarily ruled by a single capital or emperor. So if it wasn't an empire, what exactly was it? Instead of a top-down hierarchy, Harappa was a vast, decentralized, city-centered system. It was this incredibly sophisticated network where multiple urban centers functioned as equal partners. Think of it less like a strict pyramid with a king at the very top, and more like a modern interconnected web of bustling hubs constantly sharing ideas and resources. And they really needed to share that knowledge because they were dealing with some seriously tough environments. Take the city of Dholavira and Gujarat, for example. Rather than focusing just on building massive fort walls and grain silos to project military power, these people focused heavily on surviving their semi-arid landscape. We now understand that mastering water through these incredibly sophisticated reservoirs, intricate channels, and stepwells was the absolute core of Harappan identity and urban engineering. They were environmental adapters, first and foremost. Part 2. The Indus continuity. So, if they didn't have a centralized empire to dramatically collapse, what actually happened to them? The old myth claimed a catastrophic, violent Aryan invasion, swept in and just wiped out the civilization overnight. But the archaeological reality is entirely different. There was no sudden violent end. Instead, what we actually see in the dirt is regional restructuring. Basically, the climate shifted, the rivers changed, and so the massive urban centers naturally shrank. But the people didn't just vanish. They moved to smaller towns and villages, bringing their Harappan technologies, crafts, and cultural patterns right along with them. And the definitive proof of this lies right in our biology. Recent genetic work on ancient skeletons from the site of Rakhigarhi confirms there is direct biological continuity between these Harappan-era people and present-day South Asians. That's absolutely crucial. They never vanished. The Harappan world was deeply rooted in the subcontinent, and present-day South Asians are quite literally carrying that biological, technological, and cultural legacy forward today. All right, part 3, Mesopotamia beyond the cradle. Let's move to our next geographic focus and see how this exact same paradigm shift is rewriting the story of the Middle East. Just like in the Indus Valley, the whole sudden spark theory is completely dead. Modern excavations have probed deep into prehistory. If we trace the timeline back, long before the cradle of civilization officially birthed the famous Sumerian cities, early village cultures at places like Zawi Chimi, Shanadar were already heavily experimenting with farming and pastoralism.
By the Uboid period, settlements had already developed complex irrigation, extensive trade, and deep ritual traditions. The groundwork wasn't laid overnight. It was built over thousands of years of human experimentation.
And when those massive cities did finally emerge, they definitely weren't isolated, solitary kingdoms. Just like Harappa, we're looking at dense regional networks of interconnected, polycentric cities. Centers like Uruk, and Kish each had their own unique political and economic profiles. And recent digs at places like Kurd Kabristan in Iraq show that even these so-called second-tier cities were thriving administrative hubs packed with dense residential neighborhoods. They were inextricably linked in a massive regional web. Now, this is where the story gets incredibly human, and honestly, it's my favorite part. We used to think that the invention of writing, cuneiform, was this highly guarded secret, locked away in temples and palaces strictly for high-ranking scribes and kings. But new tablet finds reveal everyday cuneiform use. We're finding trade contracts, personal letters, and yes, even the rules for board games. It turns out humanity has literally been arguing over the rules of tabletop games for over 4,000 years. This detail is just fascinating because it shows a vibrant reading culture was deeply embedded in everyday urban life. As we now understand, writing wasn't just some elite magic reserved for kings. It was a commercial and educational practice completely embedded in urban life. This radically democratizes our view of ancient Mesopotamians. They weren't just mindless subjects toiling away under a god king. They were merchants drafting contracts, students learning their syllables, and regular, everyday people playing games after a long day of work. And they absolutely needed that community ingenuity because their environment was incredibly volatile. Mesopotamian cities were highly vulnerable to canal failures and soil salinization, which is where salt buildup literally ruins the farmland. But here's the kicker. When faced with these severe climate vulnerabilities, these cities didn't just permanently fall into a dark age. Instead, they exhibited incredible adaptive resilience. They went through continuous cycles. They'd grow, then fragment when the environment failed, and then they would re-centralize and relocate to adapt to the new normal. We see this resilience repeatedly across Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria.
Part 4. A new human narrative. Let's bring all of these incredible pieces together. When we put these pieces side by side, a completely unified understanding of human origins emerges. Whether we're looking at the Indus Valley or the Middle East, those old stories of sudden, centralized, and fragile empires are just gone. Early civilization was defined by gradual, deep-rooted growth. It was structured around cooperative, polycentric networks rather than strict top-down hierarchies. And most importantly, its defining feature was immense long-term survival and resilience in the face of constantly shifting climates. Furthermore, these regions weren't even isolated from each other. We really have to stop thinking of these cradles as sealed-off zones. They were part of a much wider West Asian cultural field. There was constant, ongoing interregional contact, spanning all the way from Anatolia and the Levant, through Mesopotamia, down to the Gulf, and across to Iran and the Indus. They traded heavily in metals, precious stones, and luxury goods, and right along with those goods, they traded shared myths, legal structures, and religious ideas. It was a thriving, cosmopolitan, ancient globalism. Which leads us to this final, absolutely crucial takeaway. As we face our own modern crises of climate change and shifting global dynamics, we often worry about the collapse of our society. But look at our ancestors. It's a really profound thought to end our explainer on today. If humanity survived and actually thrived through decentralized adaptability, shared knowledge, and environmental resilience in the past, well, perhaps that's exactly the blueprint we need for the challenges of tomorrow. Thank you so much for exploring this new narrative with me. Keep questioning the old stories and keep learning.